Hook. What would you do if you discovered that the person you trusted most in the world had orchestrated your worst nightmare? Sarah Mitchell thought she knew the answer to that question until the moment a single word shattered everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the man she had shared her bed with for 7 years. The rain hammered against the windows of the small cottage like angry fists demanding entry. Sarah Mitchell pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she moved through the dimly lit living room, checking the locks one final time before bed. It was past midnight, and her husband David wouldn't be home from his business trip until Thursday. 3 more days of sleeping alone in their isolated home on Maple Creek Road. She had grown accustomed to these lonely nights over the past 2 years. David's consulting work required frequent travel, sometimes keeping him away for weeks at a time. The money was good, better than anything they had ever dreamed of when they first married fresh out of college. It allowed them to buy this beautiful cottage nestled in the woods 30 minutes from the nearest neighbor. Sarah loved the privacy and serenity during the day, but nights like this made her question whether the isolation was worth it. As she reached for the front door deadbolt, a sharp crack echoed from the back of the house. Sarah froze, her hand suspended inches from the lock. The sound came again, deliberate and forceful. Someone was trying to break in through the kitchen door. Her heart began racing as she grabbed her cell phone from the coffee table. No signal. The storm must have knocked out the nearest tower again. She cursed under her breath, remembering how David had promised to install a landline months ago but never found the time between his trips. Another crack, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The nearest neighbor was too far to reach on foot, especially in this weather. Her car keys were in the kitchen, exactly where the intruders were trying to enter. She was trapped, moving as quietly as possible. Sarah crept toward the hallway closet where David kept his grandfather's old baseball bat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the smooth wooden handle. She had never used it as a weapon before. But tonight, she might not have a choice. The back door finally gave way with a loud crash that made Sarah jump. Heavy footsteps echoed through the kitchen, followed by hushed voices. There were at least 2 of them, maybe more. She pressed herself against the wall at the end of the hallway, bat raised, trying to control her breathing. "Check upstairs first," a gruff voice commanded. "She's probably sleeping." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. They knew she was here. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had told them exactly when to come, when she would be alone and vulnerable. She heard one set of footsteps heading toward the staircase while another moved through the ground floor. Sarah knew she had seconds to act before they discovered she wasn't in bed. The element of surprise was her only advantage. As the first intruder rounded the corner into the hallway, Sarah swung the bat with every ounce of strength she possessed. The wooden weapon connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a howl of pain. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. Sarah bolted toward the living room, hoping to reach the front door before the second intruder could cut her off. "She's down here," the injured man shouted, clutching his arm. "The little witch broke my shoulder." Sarah's fingers fumbled with the front door locks as heavy footsteps thundered behind her. She managed to turn the deadbolt just as rough hands grabbed her from behind, pulling her away from her escape route. "Going somewhere, sweetheart?" The second intruder's breath reeked of alcohol and cigarettes. He was bigger than his partner, with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had seen too many fights. Sarah drove her elbow backward into his ribs and broke free, still clutching the baseball bat. She spun around and took another swing, this time aiming for his head. He ducked and lunged forward, tackling her to the ground. The bat skittered across the hardwood floor as Sarah fought with desperate fury. She clawed at his face, leaving deep scratches along his cheek. When he tried to pin her arms, she bit down hard on his wrist until she tasted blood. "Crazy woman," he snarled, backhanding her across the face. Stars exploded across Sarah's vision, but she refused to give up. She had to survive this. She had to make it through the night. The first intruder had recovered enough to help his partner. Together they managed to subdue Sarah, zip-tying her hands behind her back despite her continued struggles. "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, spitting blood from her split lip. "There's no money here, no expensive jewelry. Take whatever you can find and leave." The 2 men exchanged glances before the larger one spoke. "We're not here for money, lady. We're here for you." Fear, colder than the storm outside, settled in Sarah's chest. These weren't burglars. They were kidnappers, and someone had hired them specifically to take her. But who would want to hurt her? She was a kindergarten teacher in a small town. She had no enemies, no dangerous secrets. "You've made a mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm nobody important. You have the wrong person." Sarah Mitchell, 407, Maple Creek Road. Married to David Mitchell, drives a blue Honda Civic. The smaller man recited from memory, wincing as he favored his injured shoulder. Yeah, we got the right person. Someone had provided them with detailed information about her life, her schedule, her husband's travel plans. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't random. Someone she knew had betrayed her. Who sent you? Sarah whispered. Neither man answered as they began discussing logistics in hushed tones. Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. Something about a van parked down the road. A cabin in the mountains. Instructions to keep her alive but compliant. While they talked, Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Who had access to her daily routine? Who knew David's travel schedule well enough to plan this? The list was disturbingly short. Her sister lived in California and rarely called. Her parents had passed away 3 years ago. David's family lived across the country. That left her co-workers at the elementary school, a few neighbors, and David's business associates. None of them seemed capable of orchestrating a kidnapping. The whole situation felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The smaller intruder returned from checking the upstairs rooms. Place is clean. No one else here. Let's move before this storm gets worse. The larger man grabbed Sarah's arm and hauled her to her feet. You're going to walk to our van nice and quiet. Try to run or scream and things will get very unpleasant for you.
Sarah nodded, her mind still searching for any possible escape opportunity.
As they moved toward the front door, she noticed the smaller man limping badly. Her bat had done more damage than she initially thought. If she could somehow break free, she might be able to outrun him. But his partner was uninjured and looked like he could chase her down even in this weather. The wind nearly knocked them over as they stepped outside. The storm had intensified, turning the rain into horizontal sheets that stung like needles. Sarah's thin nightgown and cardigan provided no protection against the elements. Within seconds, she was soaked to the skin and shivering violently. A dark van waited at the end of her driveway, its engine running. Sarah realized this might be her last chance to escape before they took her somewhere far from help. She pretended to stumble on the slippery gravel, then suddenly jerked away from her captor's grip. She made it exactly 3 steps before he tackled her again, driving her face first into the muddy ground. This time, the impact knocked the wind from her lungs. She lay gasping, tasting dirt and rain while he hauled her upright. I warned you, he growled in her ear. Next time you try something stupid, I'll break both your legs. They dragged her the rest of the way to the van and threw her into the back, where a third man waited behind the wheel. Sarah's heart sank as she realized she was outnumbered 3-1. Even if she hadn't been restrained, the odds of fighting her way free were virtually zero. The van's interior smelled like old cigarettes and motor oil. There were no windows in the back, and a metal partition separated her from the driver. Sarah found herself in complete darkness as they drove away from her home, possibly forever. As the miles passed, Sarah forced herself to think logically despite her fear. Someone had planned this carefully. They knew her routines, her vulnerabilities, her husband's schedule. They had watched her house and chosen the perfect night to strike. This level of preparation suggested either a professional operation or someone with intimate knowledge of her life. The van hit a pothole, throwing Sarah against the metal wall. Her zip-tied hands had gone numb hours ago, and her face throbbed where she'd been struck. But physical discomfort paled compared to the growing certainty that someone she trusted had orchestrated this nightmare. Her thoughts turned to David, wondering if he was safe or if these men had targeted him as well. Maybe they were using her as leverage to force him to do something. His consulting work involved several high-profile clients. Perhaps one of them had enemies willing to hurt innocent people. But even as she clung to this theory, doubt gnawed at her mind. David's behavior had been strange lately, more distant, secretive about his work calls, protective of his phone and laptop. She had attributed it to stress from a difficult client. But what if there was more to it? The van slowed and turned onto what felt like a gravel road. Sarah could hear rocks pinging against the undercarriage as they climbed steadily upward. They were heading into the mountains, just as the men had discussed. Soon they would reach their destination, and her chances of escape would disappear entirely. Sarah tested the zip ties around her wrists, hoping the rain might have loosened them. The plastic had bitten deep into her skin, but she could feel a tiny amount of give if she twisted a certain way. It wasn't much, but it was something to focus on besides her growing despair. The van finally stopped after what felt like hours of driving. Sarah heard the men talking outside before the rear doors opened, flooding the space with gray dawnlight. She had been unconscious longer than she realized. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. They pulled her from the van, and she got her first look at their destination. A small wooden cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. There were no other buildings visible, no signs of civilization. Even if she managed to escape, she would be lost in thousands of acres of wilderness. "Welcome to your new home," the large man said mockingly as they dragged her toward the cabin door. Inside, the space was spartanly furnished with a few pieces of old furniture and a stone fireplace. The windows had been boarded up from the inside, blocking any view of the outside world. A single battery-powered lantern provided the only light. They forced Sarah into a wooden chair and secured her ankles to the legs with more zip ties. She was now completely immobilized, dependent on her captors for food, water, and basic human needs. The helplessness was almost worse than the physical discomfort. "Someone will be along to talk to you soon," the smaller man said, still favoring his injured shoulder. "Until then, I suggest you cooperate. The people we work for don't appreciate difficult prisoners." Sarah waited until they left the cabin before allowing herself to cry. The tears came in great shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her lost freedom, for the life that had been stolen from her, for the betrayal that had made this possible. When the tears finally stopped, she began working methodically on the zip tie around her wrists. The plastic had sharp edges that cut into her skin with every movement, but she ignored the pain. Pain was temporary. Giving up was permanent. Hours passed in the dim cabin. Sarah's captors brought her water and a stale sandwich but refused to answer any of her questions. They seemed to be waiting for someone, checking their phones frequently and talking in hushed voices outside. As afternoon faded into evening, Sarah heard a car approaching. Her heart hammered as footsteps approached the cabin door. This was it. She was about to meet the person responsible for her kidnapping, the mastermind who had orchestrated her nightmare. The door opened and a familiar silhouette appeared against the dying light. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as recognition hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't even one of David's business associates. The person who stepped into the cabin was someone she had trusted completely, someone she had never suspected of being capable of such cruelty. As their eyes met across the dim space, Sarah felt her world shift on its axis. "Hello, Sarah," the visitor said quietly. "I suppose you have questions." Sarah stared in shock, her mind reeling from the betrayal. Of all the people who might have wanted to hurt her, this was the last person she would have suspected, the last person who should have wanted to see her suffer. But before she could voice her confusion and pain, before she could demand answers to the 1,000 questions racing through her mind, her visitor spoke a single word that changed everything Sarah thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and the people she loved. That word would haunt her for the rest of her days, a verbal bomb that destroyed every assumption she had built her adult life upon. It was a word that revealed the true depth of the conspiracy against her and the shocking reason why she had been taken from everything she held dear.
As the word hung in the air between them, Sarah realized that surviving her physical captivity might be easier than surviving the emotional devastation that was about to unfold.
The word was insurance. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. Her visitor stepped fully into the lantern light, revealing features Sarah had memorized over countless family dinners, birthday parties, and holiday gatherings. It was her sister-in-law, Rebecca Mitchell, David's younger sister who lived just 2 towns over.
"Insurance?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the confined space.
"What are you talking about?" Rebecca pulled up a second wooden chair and sat down, studying Sarah with an expression that was both familiar and terrifyingly foreign. This was the same woman who had been Sarah's maid of honor, who had helped her pick out wedding decorations and plan birthday surprises for David. But the warmth that had always characterized Rebecca's face was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "David took out a very large life insurance policy on you 6 months ago," Rebecca said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. $2 million, to be exact. Enough to solve all of our problems and then some. Sarah's mind struggled to process this information. "Our problems? What problems? And why would David take out a policy without telling me?" Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Sweet, naive Sarah. You really don't know anything, do you? David's been hiding a lot from you lately, more than you could possibly imagine." The zip ties cut deeper into Sarah's wrists as she leaned forward, desperate for answers. "What are you talking about?" "David and I tell each other everything. We don't have secrets."
Is that what you think?
Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. She opened it slowly, deliberately, like someone savoring a fine wine.
"Let me enlighten you about your perfect husband and your perfect marriage. She pulled out the first document and held it where Sarah could see. It was a bank statement, but not from any account Sarah recognized. The balance showed negative $67,000. David's been gambling, Rebecca explained. Online poker, sports betting, casino trips during his supposed business travel. He's not just broke, Sarah. He's drowning in debt. Sarah shook her head violently. That's impossible. I handle our finances. I would know if we had money problems. You handle the household checking account, Rebecca corrected. David has been very careful to keep his addiction hidden from you. Separate accounts, credit cards in his name only, cash advances you never see. He's been living a double life for over 2 years. The next document Rebecca produced was even more devastating. It was a letter from a loan shark in Las Vegas, demanding immediate payment of $130,000. The letterhead bore the name of a company Sarah had never heard of, and the language was politely threatening in a way that made her skin crawl. David borrowed money from very dangerous people, Rebecca continued. People who don't accept excuses or payment plans. They want their money within the next 2 weeks or they're going to start breaking bones. Maybe yours, maybe his. They haven't decided yet. Sarah felt sick. The man she had shared her bed with for 7 years, the man she had trusted with her heart and her future, had been lying to her about everything. But even this betrayal paled compared to what Rebecca was suggesting. So you decided to kill me for the insurance money? Sarah asked, her voice stronger now despite the fear coursing through her veins. You're willing to murder your own brother's wife? Rebecca's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked like the woman Sarah remembered.
It doesn't have to be murder, Sarah.
We're not monsters. This can all go away if you're willing to help us. Help you how? Rebecca pulled out another document, this one freshly printed. This is a life insurance claim form. All it needs is your signature and a witness. According to our story, you went hiking alone in the mountains and fell from a cliff. Your body was never recovered, but after 7 years you can be declared legally dead. David collects the money, pays off his debts, and starts fresh.
Sarah stared at the form in disbelief. You want me to fake my own death?
Disappear forever. It's better than the alternative, Rebecca said quietly. If David can't pay back the money he owes, those men in Vegas aren't just going to hurt him, they're going to hurt everyone he cares about. That includes you, Sarah. They know where you work, where you live, what route you take to the grocery store. You're not safe as long as David's debt exists. The cabin fell silent except for the distant sound of wind in the pine trees. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process everything she had learned. Her husband was a gambling addict who had borrowed money from criminals. Sarah, her sister-in-law, was willing to fake her death to solve the problem. The 3 men who had kidnapped her were waiting outside to make sure she cooperated. What about my life? Sarah asked finally. My job, my friends, my students. You expect me to just walk away from everything I built? Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with those cold, calculating eyes.
Your students will miss you for a few weeks and then forget you ever existed.
Children are resilient that way. As for your friends, how many of them do you actually have? You spend most of your time alone in that cottage, waiting for David to come home from his trips. This isn't really such a big change. The cruelty of the observation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Sarah had become increasingly isolated over the past few years, partly due to their remote location and partly due to David's frequent absences. She had let many friendships fade, telling herself that her marriage was enough. Where would I go? Sarah asked, hating herself for even considering the proposition. How would I survive? We've thought of that, Rebecca said, producing yet another document. There's a cabin in Alaska completely off the grid. No neighbors for 50 miles, but there's a well, solar panels, enough supplies to last a year. After that, you'd be on your own. But you're a smart woman. You'd figure it out. Sarah looked at the property deed Rebecca was showing her. The cabin was located in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by bush plane or a 3-day hike through wilderness. It might as well be another planet, and if I refuse... Rebecca's mask of civility slipped for a moment, revealing the desperation underneath. Then we have to go with Plan B. The 3 men outside aren't just hired muscle, Sarah. They're professionals. They can make your death look like an accident, or they can make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. Either way, David still gets the insurance money and his problems disappear. The threat hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Sarah finally understood that she wasn't going to be rescued. No one knew where she was. David wouldn't even know she was missing for another 2 days, and by then it would be too late. Her only choice was how she wanted to die, quickly at the hands of killers, or slowly in an Alaskan wilderness. How do I know you'll keep your word? Sarah asked. How do I know you won't just kill me anyway once I sign that paper? Because dead women can't spend money, Rebecca replied pragmatically. If your body is found, the insurance company will investigate. They'll discover the policy was recent, and they'll start asking uncomfortable questions. David needs you to stay disappeared, not dead. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think. There had to be another option, some way to escape this impossible situation. But she was tied to a chair in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by armed men who were being paid to ensure her cooperation. Even if she could somehow get free, where would she run to? I need time to think, Sarah said finally. Rebecca checked her watch. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, we implement Plan B whether you've decided or not. She gathered up her documents and headed toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. For what it's worth, Sarah, I am sorry it came to this. I always liked you, but David is my family, and family comes first. After Rebecca left, Sarah sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the muffled conversation outside. The three men were discussing shift schedules and provisions, making it clear they'd planned to stay for several days if necessary. Sarah began working on her restraints again, ignoring the fresh pain as the plastic cut deeper into her already wounded wrists. She had to find a way out of this cabin, out of these mountains, before morning came. But even if she succeeded, what then? Rebecca had made it clear that dangerous people knew where she lived and worked. Going home would only delay the inevitable. As night fell completely, one of the men brought her another sandwich and a bottle of water. He checked her restraints perfunctorily and left without saying a word. Sarah waited until his footsteps faded before resuming her efforts to escape. Hours passed in painful, methodical work. Sarah's hands were slick with blood from the zip-tie wounds, but she could feel the plastic beginning to weaken. The trick was applying pressure at just the right angle, while maintaining enough circulation to keep her fingers functional. Around midnight, Sarah heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Through the boarded windows, she could see headlight beams sweeping across the clearing. Someone else was arriving, and she had a terrible feeling she knew who it was. The cabin door opened and David stepped inside, looking haggard and desperate. Sarah's heart broke all over again as she saw the man she had loved and trusted for so many years. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wild desperation she had never seen before. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "God, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to come to this. How could you?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to me? I trusted you. I loved you." David dropped into the chair Rebecca had vacated, burying his face in his hands. I know how it looks, but you have to understand. I was going to tell you everything. I was going to get help for the gambling. But then those men from Vegas showed up at my hotel room and they made it very clear what would happen if I didn't pay them back. So you decided to cash in on my life." Sarah's voice was bitter with betrayal. "You took out an insurance policy and planned my death?" "No." David looked up sharply. "The insurance policy was Rebecca's idea. I thought maybe we could get a loan against it, use that money to pay off the debt. I never thought about actually using it until she explained how desperate our situation really was." Sarah stared at her husband, searching his face for some sign of the man she had married. "Our situation? I'm not the one who gambled away our future, David. I'm not the one who borrowed money from criminals. But you're the one they'll hurt to get to me," David said quietly. "These aren't people who make empty threats, Sarah. If I don't pay them back, they will torture you to make me suffer before they kill us both." The horrible logic of the situation began to sink in. David's gambling addiction had created a web of danger that trapped them both. The men he owed money to would use any leverage necessary to collect their debt, and Sarah represented the perfect pressure point. "There has to be another way," Sarah insisted. "We can go to the police, enter witness protection, something." "The police can't protect us from these people. They have connections everywhere, resources we can't imagine. The only way to make this stop is to give them what they want, by killing me." "By making you disappear," David corrected. "Rebecca showed you the cabin in Alaska, right? It's not ideal, but you'd be safe there. Safer than you are anywhere in the lower 48 as long as I owe this money." Sarah tested her restraints again, feeling the zip tie give a little more. "And what about you? What happens to your life after I'm gone?" "I start over," David said simply. "Pay off the debt, get into a treatment program. Try to become the man you deserved me to be all along." The conversation was surreal. They were discussing the end of their marriage, the destruction of her identity as if planning a vacation. Sarah couldn't reconcile the caring tone in David's voice with the monstrous nature of what he was asking her to do. I can't do it, Sarah said finally. I can't just disappear and pretend to be dead. I won't sign that paper. David's face crumpled. Then they'll kill us both. Is that really better than giving you a chance to live? Before Sarah could answer, the cabin door burst open and one of the kidnappers entered with his weapon drawn. We've got company, he announced tersely. Multiple vehicles, looks like law enforcement. David jumped to his feet, panic replacing desperation on his face. The fact that I found us, someone had discovered her disappearance and tracked her down. She was going to be rescued after all. But as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Rebecca appeared in the doorway looking furious rather than frightened.
This changes everything, she said coldly, glaring at David.
If the police take Sarah alive, she'll tell them everything. The gambling, the debt, the insurance policy. We'll all go to prison. The kidnapper raised his weapon towards Sarah, his intention clear. David stepped between them. His arms spread wide in protection. Wait, David said urgently. There's still time to stick with the original plan. We can say she escaped during the confusion, make it look like she ran into the woods. They'll search for weeks and never find a body. Sarah finally felt the zip tie around her wrists snap. Her hands were free, though her fingers were too numb to be immediately useful. She kept her arms behind her back, not wanting to reveal her partial escape until the right moment. The sirens were very close now, maybe a quarter-mile down the mountain road. Rebecca looked between David and the kidnapper, calculating odds and options with frightening speed. Kill them both, she decided. Make it look like a kidnapping gone wrong. I'll tell the police I tried to negotiate with the kidnappers, but they panicked when they heard the sirens. The kidnapper nodded and adjusted his aim, but David threw himself sideways, knocking the weapon aside just as it discharged. The bullet splintered the wooden wall, inches from Sarah's head. Sarah lunged forward, her legs still tied to the chair but her hands free to fight. She grabbed the battery-powered lantern and swung it like a club, catching the kidnapper in the temple. Backward, giving David time to wrestle the gun away from him. Chaos erupted in the small cabin as the two other kidnappers rushed in to help their partner. David fired twice, the shots deafeningly loud in the confined space. Sarah couldn't see who was hit, but she heard someone scream in pain. She worked frantically at the zip ties around her ankles, her fingers finally regaining enough feeling to manipulate the plastic. The ties were tighter than the ones around her wrists, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Outside, the sirens had stopped, replaced by the sound of car doors slamming and voices shouting orders. The cavalry had arrived, but the battle inside the cabin was far from over. Rebecca had found a knife somewhere and was advancing on Sarah with murder in her eyes. This is all your fault, she snarled. If you had just signed the paper, none of this would have happened. Sarah finally freed her legs just as Rebecca lunged forward with the blade. She rolled sideways out of the chair, feeling the knife slice through the air where her throat had been a moment before. Her sudden movement sent her tumbling to the floor, but at least she was mobile again. The cabin door exploded inward as armed police officers poured into the space, shouting commands and pointing weapons in every direction. The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun, with all three kidnappers and Rebecca dropping their weapons and raising their hands. David still held his commandeered pistol, but he let it fall to the floor when he saw the officers. Sarah lay on her side near the overturned chair, breathing heavily and trying to process the fact that she was finally safe.
Sarah Mitchell?
One of the officers approached her carefully. Ma'am, are you injured? She looked down at her blood-soaked wrists and torn nightgown, then up at the concerned face above her. I think so, she managed, but I'm alive. As the officers helped her to her feet and began checking her injuries, Sarah caught sight of David being handcuffed near the door. Their eyes met across the chaos of the crime scene, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see there. Relief. Despite everything that had happened, despite the web of lies and betrayal that had brought them to this moment, David looked genuinely relieved that she had survived. It was the first authentic emotion she had seen from him all night, and it left her more confused than ever about what she was supposed to feel. But that confusion would have to wait. The paramedics had arrived and were insisting on taking her to the hospital for treatment.
As they loaded her into the ambulance, Sarah took one last look at the cabin where her old life had died and something new had begun. She still didn't know what that new life would look like, or how she would rebuild from the ashes of so much betrayal.
But she was alive to find out, and for now, that was enough. 3 months after the rescue, Sarah sat in the witness stand of the county courthouse, her hands folded in her lap to hide the fading scars on her wrists. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious locals, and family members of the accused. Every eye was on her as the prosecutor prepared to ask the questions that would determine the fate of 4 people who had once been part of her inner circle. The healing process had been more complex than Sarah had anticipated. The physical wounds from the zip ties had healed within weeks, but the emotional damage ran much deeper.
She had spent countless hours with a therapist trying to untangle the web of betrayal and determine which memories of her marriage were real and which had been elaborate deceptions. The investigation that followed her rescue had revealed the true scope of David's lies.
His gambling addiction stretched back 5 years, not 2, as Rebecca had claimed. He had lost their entire savings, mortgaged their house without her knowledge, and even borrowed against her retirement account. The business trips she thought were legitimate consulting work were actually desperate attempts to win back money at casinos across the country. What hurt most wasn't the financial devastation, though. That was significant. Was the realization that she had been living with a stranger. The man she thought she knew. The man she had trusted with her heart and her future. Had been a carefully constructed fiction. David had become so skilled at maintaining his double life that even his closest friends and family had no idea of his addiction until the FBI investigation brought it all to light. Mrs. Bester, Mitchell, the prosecutor said gently, drawing her attention back to the present, "Can you tell the court how you first became aware that something was wrong on the night of October 15th? Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events of that terrible night. She had told this story dozens of times to police officers, FBI agents, and lawyers, but speaking it aloud in front of David still felt surreal. He sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking older and more haggard than she remembered. Sometimes she caught him staring at her with an expression that might have been regret, but she had learned not to trust her ability to read his emotions. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah described fighting off the intruders, being kidnapped, and learning about the insurance policy that was supposed to fund her husband's freedom from debt. When she reached the part about Rebecca's cold explanation of the plan, several jurors visibly recoiled. "And when your husband arrived at the cabin," the prosecutor continued, "what was your impression of his emotional state?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading. In the months since her rescue, she had replayed that conversation with David countless times, trying to understand his motivations and her own feelings about them. "He seemed genuinely remorseful," Sarah said slowly, "but also desperate. He kept insisting that he was trying to protect me from the people he owed money to, that making me disappear was the only way to keep me safe." "Did you believe him?" Sarah hesitated. This was the core of her confusion, the question that kept her awake at night. "I wanted to believe him. Despite everything he had done, part of me still loved the man I thought I had married. But I couldn't reconcile that love with his willingness to erase my entire existence to solve his problems." The defense attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s, stood to object. "Your Honor, the witness is speculating about my client's motivations." "Sustained," the judge replied. "The jury will disregard the witness's opinion about the defendant's motivations." But Sarah could see in the jurors' faces that the damage was done. They had heard the pain in her voice, the betrayal that ran deeper than any physical wound. She was no longer just a victim giving testimony. She was a woman whose entire reality had been shattered by someone she trusted. The prosecution took Sarah through the rest of that night, including the terrifying moments when Rebecca had tried to kill her to prevent her from testifying. The knife attack had lasted only seconds, but Sarah could still feel the cold steel passing inches from her throat. She touched the small scar on her collarbone where the blade had nicked her during the struggle. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney approached for cross-examination. Sarah had been warned this would be the most difficult part, where David's lawyer would try to paint her husband as a victim of circumstances, rather than a willing participant in conspiracy and attempted murder.
Mrs. Terra, sir? This is David Ben Wardman.
"Mitchell," the defense attorney began, "you've testified that your husband seemed remorseful about the situation. In fact, he tried to protect you when the situation became violent, didn't he?" "Yes," Sarah admitted reluctantly.
"And he was the one who wrestled the gun away from one of the kidnappers, potentially saving your life." "Yes, but he was also the one who put me in that situation to begin with." The defense attorney smiled thinly.
"Mrs. Mitchell, are you aware that your husband received death threats from his creditors in Las Vegas? Threats that specifically mentioned harming you if the debt wasn't paid?" Sarah felt her composure wavering.
She hadn't been told about specific threats against her during the investigation. The prosecutor had mentioned that David claimed to be protecting her, but she had assumed it was just another manipulation. "I wasn't aware of specific threats," she said carefully. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Defense Exhibit A." The attorney handed a stack of documents to the court clerk. These are communications between Mr. Mitchell and his creditors, dating back 6 weeks before the kidnapping. I'll read just one excerpt. Your pretty wife takes a very predictable route to work every morning. It would be unfortunate if something happened to her because you couldn't pay your bills on time. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications sank in. The threats were real. David hadn't been manipulating her when he said dangerous people were targeting her, but that still didn't excuse what he had done. Even if my husband was trying to protect me, Sarah said, her voice stronger now, he chose the wrong way to do it. He chose to fake my death rather than trust me with the truth. He chose to let me be terrorized and traumatized rather than face his problems honestly. The defense attorney nodded as if she had expected this answer. Mrs. Mitchell, if your husband had told you the truth about his debts and the threats against you, what would you have done? Sarah thought for a moment. I would have insisted we go to the police. Or the FBI. I would have wanted to face the problem together as a team. And if the police had been unable to protect you, if these criminals had carried out their threats anyway, then at least we would have faced it honestly, together, instead of him making decisions about my life without my knowledge or consent. This was the crux of Sarah's anger, the betrayal that went beyond the gambling and the lies. David had decided her fate without giving her a choice in the matter. He had treated her like a child who couldn't handle adult problems, rather than a partner who deserved to know the truth about her own life. The cross-examination continued for another hour, but Sarah held her ground. When it was finally over, she felt drained but not defeated. She had told her truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide what justice looked like. During the recess, Sarah stepped outside the courthouse for fresh air. The media had been relentless throughout the trial, dubbing it the insurance love triangle case, despite the fact that romance had played no role in the conspiracy. Sarah had learned to ignore the reporters, but their presence was a constant reminder that her private pain had become public entertainment. Her victim's advocate, a kind woman named Maria, joined her on the courthouse steps. How are you feeling? She asked. Like I'm testifying against a stranger, Sarah replied honestly. The man in that courtroom isn't the David I thought I married. But he isn't the monster the prosecution is painting either. He's something in between, and that's almost harder to understand. Maria nodded. She had worked with victims of domestic violence and financial abuse for years, and she understood the complex emotions that arose when love and betrayal became entangled. Have you thought about what you'll do after the trial? She asked. Sarah had thought about little else during the long months of legal proceedings. Her old life was gone, destroyed not by the kidnappers but by the revelations that followed her rescue. The cottage where she and David had lived was being sold to pay his creditors. Her job at the elementary school felt impossible to return to, not because of any fault of hers, but because every child's question about her missing weeks had reopened wounds she was trying to heal. I'm thinking about moving, Sarah said. Maybe California, where my sister lives. Starting completely fresh somewhere nobody knows my story.
That might be wise, Maria agreed. Sometimes, the best healing happens when we're not constantly reminded of our trauma. The afternoon session focused on Rebecca Mitchell's role in the conspiracy.
Sarah watched her former sister-in-law testify in her own defense, claiming that she had been trying to save her brother from certain death at the hands of his creditors. Rebecca's cold calculation had given way to tears and protests of innocence, but Sarah wasn't moved. Rebecca had been the architect of the kidnapping plot. She had researched the insurance policy loopholes, hired the professional criminals, and planned every detail of Sarah's disappearance. When that plan had started to unravel, she had been ready to commit murder to protect herself. The woman who had once helped Sarah plan birthday parties had been prepared to slit her throat without hesitation. The 3 kidnappers had already pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony had been crucial in establishing the timeline and revealing how Rebecca had recruited them for the job. They were criminals for hire, men who cared nothing about the personal drama that had motivated their employers. In some ways, Sarah found their honesty refreshing compared to the web of lies and justifications spun by David and Rebecca. As the trial entered its final week, Sarah found herself dreading both possible outcomes. If David and Rebecca were acquitted, she would have to live with the knowledge that her tormentors had escaped justice. But if they were convicted, she would carry the weight of knowing that her testimony had sent 2 people she had once loved to prison for decades. The prosecuting attorney called Sarah back to the stand for redirect examination, giving her a chance to clarify some points that the defense had muddied during cross-examination.
"Mrs. Mitchell," the prosecutor said, "the defense has suggested that your husband was acting out of love and desperation to protect you."
How do you respond to that characterization? Sarah had thought about this question for months. Love doesn't plan someone's fake death without their consent, she said firmly.
Love doesn't let someone be terrorized by kidnappers. Love doesn't make unilateral decisions about another person's entire existence. What David did might have been motivated by fear or desperation, but it wasn't love, at least not the kind of love I understand. These words seemed to resonate with the jury. Several members nodded slightly, and Sarah could see that they understood the distinction she was making. David might have convinced himself that he was protecting her, but his actions had been fundamentally selfish. One final question. The prosecutor said,
If you could speak directly to your husband right now, what would you say to him? Sarah turned to look at David for the first time since the trial began. He was staring at her with an expression of desperate hope, as if her words might somehow absolve him of his crimes.
"I would tell him that I understand he was scared," Sarah said quietly. "I understand that he felt trapped and desperate. But I would also tell him that those feelings didn't give him the right to trap me too. He had choices, and he consistently chose deception over honesty, manipulation over trust. That's not the foundation of a marriage or a life together." David's face crumpled as the words hit him. For the first time during the trial, he looked truly broken rather than just sorry he had been caught. Sarah felt a stab of pity for him, but she pushed it aside. Pity wasn't the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness would have to be earned over time if it came at all. The closing arguments took place on a gray Friday morning in late January. Sarah sat in the gallery watching lawyers summarize weeks of testimony and evidence into neat narratives of guilt and innocence. The prosecution painted David and Rebecca as cold conspirators who had been willing to destroy an innocent woman's life to solve their financial problems. The defense portrayed them as desperate people who had made terrible decisions under extreme pressure. Both narratives contained elements of truth, but neither captured the full complexity of what had happened.
Sarah had learned that real life was messier than legal arguments, that people could be both victims and perpetrators, both loving and cruel, often simultaneously. The jury deliberated for 2 days.
When they finally returned to the courtroom, their faces were grave. Sarah held her breath as the foreman read the verdicts. David was found guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and insurance fraud, but not guilty of attempted murder. The jury had apparently believed that he genuinely thought he was protecting Sarah, even as they rejected his methods. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Rebecca was found guilty on all counts, including attempted murder for the knife attack in the cabin. Her sentence was 25 years to life, effectively ensuring she would spend the rest of her productive years behind bars. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow somehow. No amount of prison time could undo the trauma she had experienced or restore the trust that had been shattered. David and Rebecca would pay for their crimes, but Sarah would pay too, in sleepless nights and therapy sessions and the constant need to rebuild her sense of security. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at Sarah as she walked to her car. She ignored them all, focusing instead on the future she was finally free to build. The insurance money that had motivated the entire conspiracy would remain untouched, held in trust until the legal proceedings were completely finished. Sarah had already decided to donate most of it to organizations that helped victims of domestic violence and financial abuse. That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary apartment, surrounded by boxes containing the few possessions she had chosen to keep from her old life. Most of her belongings had been sold or given away. She wanted to travel light to her new beginning. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister in California. "House hunting tomorrow, if you're ready. Found some beautiful places near the beach." Sarah smiled for the first time in months as she typed her response. Ready. She was finally free to choose her own path, to build a life based on honesty and trust rather than deception and fear. The woman who had been tied to that chair in a mountain cabin was gone forever, but in her place was someone stronger, someone who would never again allow others to make decisions about her fate. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Sarah thought about the single word that had changed everything: insurance. It was supposed to provide security, protection against unforeseen disasters. Instead, it had become the instrument of her betrayal and near destruction. But she had survived. She had fought off the intruders, endured the betrayal, testified at the trial, and emerged with her integrity intact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight she was finally, truly free. The nightmare that began with that single word was over, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to write a new story with her own hands,
on her own terms, in her own time. The scars on her wrists had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless someone knew to look for them. Soon Sarah hoped the scars on her heart would fade the same way, becoming part of her history but not the defining feature of her future. She had learned that survival was just the beginning. The real victory would be in building something beautiful from the ashes of everything that had been destroyed.